March 5, 1811, on a beach near Cádiz in southern Spain. Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Graham surveyed the impossible situation his 5,000 British troops faced. 9,000 French veterans were descending Barossa Hill toward his isolated force, drums beating the attack rhythm, whilst his Spanish allies, 10,000 strong under General La Peña, marched away in the opposite direction, abandoning the British to fight alone or flee. Graham was 62 years old, an age when most officers enjoyed retirement, not desperate battles against nearly 2-to-1 odds. But he'd joined the army at 43 swearing vengeance after French revolutionaries desecrated his wife's coffin, and he hadn't spent 18 years learning warfare to retreat in shame now. His troops could see the French columns emerging from pine woods, spreading across the hillside in overwhelming strength. The logical decision was retreat. Boats could evacuate them to Royal Navy ships offshore within hours. Instead, Graham made a choice that would earn one regiment immortal fame and capture the first French Eagle standard taken by British forces in the entire Peninsula War. By sunset, 5,000 exhausted British soldiers would prove that disciplined firepower and aggressive leadership could defeat superior numbers. The 87th Foot, mostly Irish recruits, relatively inexperienced, would charge uphill into French artillery and emerge with Napoleon's Imperial Eagle clutched in their hands. Why does this matter? Because Barrosa demonstrated that British infantry could win when outnumbered, abandoned, and fighting uphill against French veterans. It confirmed the tactical superiority Wellington had been proving across Spain, British two-rank lines delivering devastating firepower that French columns couldn't match. The Eagle's capture was psychological warfare, tangible proof that Napoleon's elite troops could be beaten, humiliated, and stripped of their most sacred symbols. If you're fascinated by underdog victories, tactical brilliance, and the human courage required to stand against impossible odds, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened in the next 3 hours would change how French marshals viewed British infantry forever. Graham looked at his outnumbered troops and said words that would define the battle. "We'll fight them." But how did 5,000 British troops defeat 9,000 French veterans whilst abandoned by their allies? The answer reveals why Napoleon's marshals learned to fear British redcoats. The siege of Cádiz had been grinding on for over a year by March 1811, and it was slowly strangling French resources in southern Spain. Marshal Victor's 20,000 troops encircled the city, but couldn't capture it. Cádiz sat on a narrow peninsula jutting into the Atlantic, defended by 20,000 Spanish regulars, British garrison troops, and armed civilians, all supplied endlessly by the Royal Navy. The city mattered enormously. It housed Spain's resistance government, the Cortes, which represented Spanish defiance of Joseph Bonaparte's puppet regime. It was a major naval base that gave Britain a secure foothold in southern Spain. And symbolically, Cádiz was the last significant Spanish city not under French control, a constant reminder that Spanish resistance hadn't been crushed despite 3 years of occupation. Victor couldn't assault the city directly. The defenses were too strong, and any attack would be suicidal. He couldn't starve it out because British ships brought supplies daily. So the siege settled into a stalemate that tied down 20,000 French troops who were desperately needed elsewhere, whilst Wellington bled French forces in Portugal, and guerrillas made French occupation a nightmare across Spain. By early 1811, the British and Spanish governments conceived a plan to break the siege from an unexpected direction. Rather than attacking Victor's siege lines from inside Cádiz, they'd land an Allied force 40 miles south at Tarifa, march north along the coast, and strike Victor's positions from behind. It was bold, potentially decisive, and required British and Spanish forces to cooperate effectively. The British contribution came to roughly 5,000 troops under Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Graham. His force included veteran battalions with peninsular experience, the 28th Foot, known as the North Gloucestershire Regiment, which had earned fame at Alexandria in 1801 by fighting enemies approaching from both directions simultaneously, leading to their unique back badge worn on the rear of their headgear. The Guards sent flank companies from the Coldstream Guards and 3rd Guards, elite troops, grenadiers and light infantry, the best men from their regiments. And there was the 87th Foot, the Prince of Wales's Irish regiment, composed largely of Irish recruits who were less experienced than the Guards, but would prove themselves magnificently. Additional detachments from various regiments brought Graham's total to 5,000 infantry, a handful of cavalry, and a few Portuguese artillery pieces. The Spanish contribution dwarfed the British numerically. General Manuel La Peña commanded 10,000 Spanish regulars. On paper, this created a formidable Allied force of 15,000 men. In reality, it created a command nightmare that would nearly prove fatal. La Peña was senior in rank because he commanded more troops, making him technically the overall commander despite Graham's vastly superior experience. La Peña was a political general with limited combat experience, appointed through connections rather than battlefield success. Graham, by contrast, had earned his position through competence. He'd fought at Corunna in 1809 during Sir John Moore's desperate retreat, and he'd spent years learning warfare after joining the army at 43. His motivation was intensely personal. His wife had died in 1792, and when French revolutionaries desecrated her coffin during transport through France, Graham swore vengeance against France and dedicated the rest of his life to fighting them. By 1811, he was 62, old for field command, but still physically vigorous and mentally sharp. The Allied force landed unopposed near Tarifa on March 4th. Royal Navy ships brought them ashore in boats, 15,000 troops splashing onto Spanish beaches whilst French scouts watched from a distance and galloped off to warn Marshal Victor. The landing went smoothly. The French hadn't expected an attack so far south, and by evening, the Allied force was consolidating on the beach, preparing to march north toward Cádiz 40 miles away. They carried minimal supplies because the plan called for a rapid march to hit Victor's siege lines before he could react. No tents, limited rations, just ammunition and determination. Marshal Victor learned of the landing by March 4th evening and reacted decisively. He couldn't abandon the siege completely, but he could detach a strong division to intercept the Allies before they threatened his positions. He gave the task to General Ruffin, a competent officer commanding roughly 9,000 infantry supported by cavalry squadrons and artillery batteries. Ruffin's troops were veterans, men who'd fought across Europe, confident in their ability to defeat any enemy they faced. Their mission was straightforward: block the Allied advance, prevent them from relieving Cádiz, and ideally destroy them before they could retreat to their ships. On the morning of March 5th, the Allied force marched north along the coastal road. The Spanish vanguard led under La Peña, 10,000 troops stretching along the road for perhaps a mile. Graham's 5,000 British formed the rear guard, a mile behind the Spanish. This arrangement reflected the command structure. La Peña led, Graham followed, but it created a dangerous separation. The terrain consisted of sandy beaches to their left, facing the Atlantic, low hills covered in pine forests to their right, and open ground between. Visibility was good under clear weather. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, French troops began emerging from the pine woods on Barossa Hill to their right, a low ridge rising perhaps 200 feet above the surrounding terrain. Graham saw them immediately. 9,000 French troops spreading across the hillside in attack formations, drums beating, officers on horseback directing the deployment. The French were positioning themselves between the British rearguard and the Spanish vanguard, cutting the Allied force in half. Graham sent messengers galloping toward La Peña, requesting support. The response, when it came, was devastating. La Peña refused to turn back and engage. Instead, he ordered Graham to retreat to the beach and evacuate via the Royal Navy ships offshore. La Peña's reasoning was transparently self-serving. He didn't want to risk his Spanish troops in battle, preferred to continue marching toward Cádiz, and apparently believed Graham's British force was expendable. Graham's fury was absolute. His ally had abandoned him to face 9,000 French veterans with 5,000 British troops, all because La Peña wouldn't risk combat. The Spanish were marching north, increasing the distance with every minute, whilst the French descended Barossa Hill, preparing to annihilate the isolated British. Graham's options were stark. He could retreat to the beach as La Peña ordered, evacuate his troops under French harassment, and accept the humiliation of fleeing without fighting. Or he could stand and fight nearly 2-to-1 odds with no support, risking his entire force in a battle that orthodox military wisdom said he'd lose. Most commanders would have chosen retreat. It was the sensible option, the safe option, the option that preserved the force for future operations. Graham chose to fight. The time was approximately 11:30 in the morning. French columns were visible descending the hill less than a mile away, organizing for attack. Graham's troops were strung out along the coast road in marching formation, completely unprepared for battle. They had perhaps 30 minutes to transform from a marching column into a battle line capable of receiving 9,000 French veterans attacking from high ground. The stakes were everything: British military reputation, the credibility of the Spanish alliance, the relief of Cádiz, and the lives of 5,000 soldiers who were about to discover whether their general's confidence was justified or suicidal. Sergeants began shouting orders, troops running to designated positions, companies forming 2-rank lines. Officers rode along the forming ranks, adjusting intervals, ensuring proper spacing. Men checked their muskets, ensuring powder was dry and flints were sharp. Bayonets were fixed, 17-inch steel blades that could turn a musket into a close-quarters weapon. The 87th Foot, the Irish regiment, took position on the right flank of the British line, the position closest to Barossa Hill, where the main French attack would come. They numbered roughly 650 men, mostly recruits with limited combat experience, and they'd be facing perhaps 3,000 French veterans in the first assault. If the 87th broke, the entire British line would collapse from the right. Everything depended on these Irish soldiers standing firm against odds approaching 5-to-1. French artillery opened fire from the hill around 1:45 p.m, batteries positioned on high ground giving them excellent range and observation. Cannonballs plunged into British formations, solid iron spheres weighing 6 to 12 pounds, smashing through ranks and killing men before the infantry fighting even began. British troops stood under this bombardment because they had no choice. Their limited artillery couldn't effectively respond from lower ground, so they endured whilst Graham completed his deployment. Men fell, gaps opened in the ranks, sergeants closed the gaps, and still the artillery fire continued. Then, precisely at noon, French drums beat the attack rhythm, and 9,000 infantry began advancing down the hill in 3 massive columns toward the thin British line that looked impossibly fragile against such overwhelming force. The tactical situation facing Graham at noon on March 5th was textbook desperate. His 5,000 British troops stood in 2-rank line formation on relatively open ground between Barossa Hill and the Atlantic beach, facing northeast toward 9,000 French veterans who held the high ground and were deploying with methodical confidence. The terrain offered no real defensive advantages, no walls, no ditches, no natural obstacles beyond some scattered pine trees. The beach behind them provided an escape route to Royal Navy ships, but using it meant abandoning wounded comrades and fleeing in disgrace. Graham had committed to fighting, which meant his thin red line had to survive whatever Ruffin's division threw at them. British units were stretched dangerously thin. The 87th Foot held the right flank with 650 officers, and men commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Gaff, a 31-year-old officer whose aggressive instincts would prove decisive. These were mostly Irish recruits, hardy, willing, but lacking the combat experience of Guards battalions. To their left stood the 28th Foot, the North Gloucestershire Regiment, with roughly 550 men. The 28th carried a distinguished reputation earned at Alexandria in 1801, where they'd fought back-to-back against French cavalry, earning the unique privilege of wearing a badge on both front and rear of their caps. Further left were flank companies from the Coldstream Guards and 3rd Guards, elite troops representing roughly 800 men total. These were the best-trained soldiers in the British Army, grenadiers and light infantry, selected from Guards battalions for size, strength, and ability. The remaining troops, perhaps 3,000 more, came from various regiments, formed into composite battalions for this expedition. Graham's artillery consisted of perhaps 3 or 4 Portuguese manned guns, hopelessly outmatched by French batteries positioned on Barrosa's slopes. Ruffin's division deploying opposite them represented Napoleon's military system at its core. 9,000 infantry, organized into 3 brigade-strength columns, supported by cavalry squadrons for pursuit and screening, and a dozen artillery pieces positioned to provide fire support. These weren't conscripts or second-line troops. They were veterans who'd campaigned across Europe, men who'd seen British armies flee at Corunna, who'd beaten Austrian and Prussian forces repeatedly, and who assumed British troops would break like everyone else when French columns hit them. Their formation reflected French tactical doctrine that had dominated European battlefields for 15 years. Dense columns designed to intimidate, to steamroll through enemy lines through shock and weight of numbers, to close quickly and decide battles with bayonets rather than prolonged firefights. The mathematical reality of line versus column warfare was about to be demonstrated again. Graham's 2-rank line meant every British soldier could fire his musket. Roughly 5,000 Brown Bess muskets could be brought to bear along the British front. French columns, by contrast, could only fire from their front ranks. A column of 3,000 men might be 200 wide and 15 ranks deep, but only those front 200 could actually shoot. The 900 men in the second and third ranks might get shots off in confused combat, but the remaining 2,000 would simply push forward providing weight whilst being unable to engage with their muskets. This meant that along any given section of line, British firepower could be 3 or 4 times greater than French, despite being outnumbered overall. But this advantage only worked if British troops stood their ground and delivered disciplined volleys at close range. If they panicked and broke before French columns closed, numbers would overwhelm them in pursuit. Around noon, with French artillery still pounding British positions and infantry columns beginning their descent, Graham rode along his line on horseback, making himself conspicuous to both his own troops and French gunners. Officers did this deliberately in the Napoleonic era. Visible leadership meant troops could see their commander sharing their danger, which steadied nerves. Graham's age worked in his favour here. 62-year-old generals didn't ride exposed to artillery fire unless they possessed absolute confidence in victory. His message was simple and repeated at every regiment. Hold your fire until close range, aim low, fire on command, and reload as practiced. The British advantage was firepower discipline, not individual heroics. The 87th Foot watched the main French column approaching their position. 3,000 men descending the hill in a formation that looked unstoppable. Drums beat rhythmic patterns, French officers on horseback rode ahead waving swords, soldiers shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" The psychological impact was immense. Imagine standing in a line 2 men deep, perhaps 300 yards of frontage, watching a column of 3,000 advancing toward you, knowing you're outnumbered 5-1 just in your sector. The French assumed this sight would break British morale before contact. They'd seen it work against Austrians at Wagram, against Prussians at Jena, against Russians at Friedland. Why would the British be different? The distance closed steadily. 600 yards became 500, then 400. French artillery continued firing, though less effectively as their own troops advanced into the line of fire. British artillery responded, but achieved little. Outgunned and poorly positioned, the Portuguese gun crews did their best but couldn't suppress French batteries. At 300 yards, British soldiers could clearly see individual French faces, see the white crossbelts against blue coats, see officers shouting orders. At 200 yards, sergeants began checking that every man's musket was loaded, primed, and cocked. The Brown Bess musket was a simple weapon, 75 caliber smoothbore that fired a lead ball weighing roughly an ounce. Loading required biting open a paper cartridge containing powder and ball, pouring powder down the barrel, ramming the ball home with a ramrod, priming the pan with a pinch of powder, cocking the hammer, then aiming and firing on command. A trained British infantryman could complete this sequence in 20 seconds, meaning 3 rounds per minute. At 200 yards, no command to fire came. Graham wanted them closer. 100 yards. Officers walking behind the British ranks called out ranges, steadying men. The noise was overwhelming. French drums, shouting, artillery still firing from the hill, British officers yelling to be heard. At 80 yards, the 87th's colonel raised his sword. Sergeants echoed the command down the line. Make ready! 650 muskets came to the present position, butts against shoulders, barrels levelled. Present! Every man aimed at the mass of Frenchmen now 50 yards away. At that range against a dense column, aiming was almost unnecessary. Every shot would hit something. The French front ranks had their muskets up now too, about to fire first. Fire! 650 Brown Bess muskets discharged nearly simultaneously in a sound like continuous thunder. The 75 caliber balls tore into the French front ranks at 50 yards range with devastating effect. Men in the first 3 ranks of the column simply collapsed. 200 casualties or more from a single volley. The column staggered as if it had run into a wall. Dense white smoke from black powder instantly obscured everything, rolling across the battlefield in a chemical fog that smelled of sulfur and tasted of burnt residue. The French front ranks were obliterated, but the column still had 2,800 men behind them. British sergeants screamed reload orders. In the smoke, British soldiers performed the loading sequence from muscle memory. Bite cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, cock hammer. 20 seconds. The French column attempted to return fire, but only the new front rank could shoot. Perhaps 150 muskets against 650 British. Their volley was ragged, poorly aimed in the smoke, and caused perhaps 30 casualties. The 87th's second volley crashed out before the smoke from the first had cleared. Another 650 muskets firing into the mass of Frenchmen now at 40 yards. More casualties. More chaos. The French column was designed to charge home with bayonets after delivering 1 or 2 volleys, but the British firepower was destroying their formation faster than they could close. Officers in the column shouted orders to deploy into line, spread out, get more muskets firing, but deploying from column to line takes minutes of drill, and the British were firing every 20 seconds. A third British volley tore into the French at 35 yards. The column's front ranks had ceased to exist as organized formations. Bodies carpeted the ground, wounded men screamed, and those still standing couldn't see through the smoke whether to advance or retreat. This was the moment when centuries of British infantry training paid its dividend. The 87th Foot had been drilled in musketry until loading and firing became automatic, until men could perform the sequence half awake or terrified or choking on powder smoke. French columns were designed to intimidate and overwhelm, but they couldn't function against troops who stood their ground and delivered massed fire faster than the column could close. At Wellington's battles across the peninsula, Rolitza, Vimeiro, Talavera, Busaco, British lines had repeatedly shredded French columns through this firepower advantage. Ruffin's men were learning the lesson again. Graham saw the French column staggering and made the aggressive decision that defined his generalship. Firepower had stopped the French attack. Now offence would break it entirely. 87th! Fix bayonets! The order rippled down the Irish regiment. Soldiers pulled 17-inch triangular blades from scabbards and locked them onto musket muzzles with practiced twists. Charge! 650 men who moments before had been standing on the defensive suddenly surged forward uphill into the smoke toward 3,000 French soldiers. The psychological shock was immense. French troops who'd been advancing expecting the British to break were now being charged by the men they'd just failed to overcome. The Irish regiment hit what remained of the French column's front ranks with bayonets, musket butts, and savage determination. Hand-to-hand combat in Napoleonic battles was actually rare. Most casualties came from musket fire and artillery. But when it did occur, it was brief and brutal. Bayonets were primarily psychological weapons. Their real function was making infantry dangerous to cavalry, and most infantry preferred clubbing enemies with musket butts rather than stabbing with blades. The 87th's charge didn't involve prolonged dueling. They hit the French, inflicted casualties in seconds of vicious close-quarters fighting, and the French column broke. 3,000 men who'd been attacking turned and fled back up Barossa Hill, abandoning wounded, abandoning positions, running in disorder. The Irish regiment pursued part way up the slope, capturing dozens of prisoners and, critically, several French artillery pieces that had been positioned to support the column. Whilst the 87th Foot shattered the French right, the centre and left of Graham's line faced similar assaults. The 28th Foot and Guards battalions stood against roughly 6,000 French infantry, divided into two massive columns that descended Barossa Hill with drums beating and officers waving swords. The British response was identical to the Irish regiment's: disciplined volleys at murderously close range, followed by bayonet charges that sent French columns reeling backward. The mathematics of firepower worked identically across the battlefield. 550 muskets from the 28th could deliver over 1,600 rounds per minute collectively, whilst the French column opposing them could manage perhaps 400 from their front ranks. The Guards battalions, representing Britain's military elite, performed with mechanical precision that their years of drill had perfected. They fired 3 volleys in the time French troops managed 2, and every volley was delivered at ranges where missing was nearly impossible. The Brown Bess musket's reputation as wildly inaccurate beyond 100 yards was absolutely true for individual shots. The smoothbore barrel meant balls tumbled in flight and deviated unpredictably, but massed volley fire at 50 yards into formations packed with men negated accuracy problems entirely. A 75 caliber lead ball, traveling at roughly 1,500 feet per second, would penetrate a human body completely, shatter bones, and often pass through to strike men behind. At close range into dense formations, British volleys created casualties out of all proportion to the numbers of muskets firing. French columns depended on closing quickly to negate this firepower disadvantage, but British discipline kept them standing in place, firing, reloading, firing again, until French morale broke. By 12:30, barely 20 minutes after serious fighting began, all 3 French columns had been repulsed back up Barossa Hill. Ruffin's division hadn't been destroyed. Most troops retreated in reasonable order and would rally on the hilltop. But the initial assault had failed catastrophically. French casualties approached 2,000 killed and wounded from perhaps 15 minutes of musket exchange and brief bayonet combat. British casualties were substantial too, roughly 400 men down. But the ratio favoured Graham's troops enormously. More importantly, British formations remained intact, whilst French units scrambled to reorganise on the high ground they'd abandoned. The battlefield was obscured by dense white smoke hanging in the windless air, creating a fog bank that smelled of sulphur and burnt powder. Wounded men from both sides lay scattered across the slope crying for help, medics or death. British soldiers stood in their ranks breathing heavily, faces blackened by powder residue, fingers burned from hot musket barrels, ears ringing from sustained firing. They'd just repulsed attacks by forces nearly twice their number. The logical response was consolidate positions, reform ranks, and prepare for the next French assault. Graham chose aggression instead. His tactical assessment was coldly rational. The French had retreated but weren't broken. Ruffin had reserves on the hilltop and would reorganise for another attack. If British troops stayed on the defensive, they'd face renewed assaults, ammunition would dwindle, and casualties would accumulate until French numbers overwhelmed them. But the French were currently disorganised, shaken by their repulse, vulnerable. Graham saw an opportunity and seized it with both hands. He ordered a general advance. 5,000 exhausted British troops who'd just fought off 9,000 French would now attack uphill to capture the high ground. It was tactically brilliant and operationally insane. Exactly the kind of decision that separated great commanders from cautious ones. The 87th Foot was already part-way up the slope, having pursued the French column they'd broken. Lieutenant Colonel Gough received Graham's orders to press forward toward the hilltop with enthusiasm bordering on recklessness. Ahead of them, perhaps 300 yards uphill, French artillery batteries repositioned on the crest were unlimbering to provide covering fire for retreating infantry. Beyond the guns, an eagle standard gleamed in the sunlight, the 8th Lean Regiment's sacred symbol of Napoleon's imperial authority. Every French regiment carried an eagle on a pole, a bronze sculpture of the imperial bird that represented the emperor's personal favor and the regiment's honor. Losing an eagle was the ultimate disgrace. In the entire Napoleonic Wars to this point, British forces had captured exactly 0 eagles. They were ferociously defended because losing one meant permanent dishonor. Gough pointed his sword uphill toward the batteries and eagle. The 87th Foot, reduced by casualties to perhaps 550 effectives, charged uphill through the smoke toward French positions. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and attacking uphill against artillery support, but momentum carried them forward. French gunners saw them coming and fired canister shot, artillery rounds that turned cannons into giant shotguns, spraying hundreds of musketball-sized projectiles. The Irish regiment took casualties but kept advancing, closing the distance to the batteries through sheer determination. The French 8th Lean attempted to defend their artillery and eagle with desperation born of honor. Roughly 800 soldiers formed a defensive line around the guns and their sacred standard. At 100 yards, both sides fired volleys. At 50 yards, they fired again. Then the 87th hit them with bayonets. The fighting around the eagle was savage in a way that earlier combat hadn't been. French soldiers knew what losing their eagle meant: permanent shame, regiment disbanded, officers cashiered. They fought with fanatical determination to prevent capture. British soldiers knew capturing an eagle would be the greatest prize of their military careers, proof of defeating Napoleon's elite, a trophy their regiment would carry forever. The moment of capture is historically documented, but remains somewhat confused in details due to battlefield chaos. 2 men from the 87th Foot, Ensign Edward Keogh and Sergeant Patrick Masterson, reached the eagle simultaneously through the melee of bayonets and musket butts. Keogh, a young officer, grabbed the eagle's pole. A French officer shot him through the chest at point-blank range. As Keogh fell, Sergeant Masterson seized the eagle and fought off several French soldiers attempting to reclaim it. Within seconds, other men from the 87th surrounded Masterson and the eagle, forming a protective cluster whilst French soldiers desperately tried to recover their standard. The struggle lasted perhaps 2 minutes of frantic close-quarters violence before the French 8th Lean's surviving soldiers broke and fled rather than watch their eagle carried off by the British. Masterson, bleeding from several wounds but still standing, held the eagle aloft. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. British troops, seeing the captured eagle, raised a cheer that carried across the battlefield. French troops, witnessing it, felt the shock of ultimate disgrace, their sacred symbol in enemy hands. The 87th had seized their immortality in that moment. They'd become the first British regiment in the entire Peninsula War to capture a French eagle in combat. The fighting continued briefly as other British units reached the hilltop and captured French artillery pieces, but the battle's decisive moment had passed. By 1 o'clock, British forces controlled Barrosa Hill's crest. Ruffin's division, having lost perhaps 2,500 men killed, wounded, and captured, withdrew in reasonable order toward French siege lines around Cádiz. They weren't destroyed as fighting formations, but they'd been beaten comprehensively by a force half their size. Graham's troops were too exhausted to pursue effectively. They'd been marching since dawn, fought a major engagement outnumbered 2-1, and captured positions uphill from where they'd started. Casualties had been heavy enough that aggressive pursuit risked counterattack by French reserves. The Butcher's Bill told the story clearly. British losses approached 1,200 from the 5,000 engaged, roughly 24% casualties, which was severe by any standard. The 87th Foot had suffered worst, losing perhaps 150 killed and wounded from their original 650. But French casualties exceeded 2,500 from 9,000 engaged, and crucially, they'd lost their eagle and several artillery pieces. In Napoleonic warfare, casualty ratios mattered less than who held the field and what trophies they'd captured. Graham's troops held Barossa Hill. They possessed a French eagle, and they'd proven that British infantry could win when outnumbered, abandoned by allies, and fighting uphill. The eagle itself became an object of fascination. Bronze, weighing roughly 4 pounds, mounted on a pole with regimental colours beneath it, the sculpture depicted an imperial eagle with wings spread and talons gripping a thunderbolt. Inscribed on its base, 8e Régiment d'Infanterie de Ligne. Masterson, wounded but still standing, carried it down from the hilltop whilst his regiment formed around him protectively. Graham, upon seeing it, reportedly said simply, "Well done, the 87th." It was magnificent understatement for a regiment that had just earned immortality. The Eagle's capture transformed Barossa from a successful defensive action into a legendary victory with psychological ramifications far beyond the tactical result. Sergeant Patrick Masterson, bleeding from sword cuts and a musketball wound, carried the bronze standard down Barossa Hill, surrounded by what remained of the 87th Foot's companies. The French 8th Ligne's sacred symbol, representing Napoleon's personal favour, the regiment's honour, and France's military supremacy, was now a British trophy. For the exhausted Irish soldiers forming protective cordon around Masterson, this wasn't just a captured flag. Eagles were different. They were blessed by Napoleon himself, consecrated in ceremonies designed to link regiment, emperor, and French glory into one sacred object. Losing one meant the regiment would be disbanded in disgrace, officers cashiered, and the unit number retired from French army rolls. Ensign Edward Keogh, who'd grabbed the eagle first before being shot through the chest, lay on the hillside among dozens of wounded waiting for stretcher bearers. The ball had penetrated his lung, and surgeons gave him minimal chance of survival with 1811 battlefield medicine. Yet Keogh would survive, spending months recovering, and would eventually return to duty. His role in the Eagle's capture would be commemorated, though Masterson received greater recognition for actually securing it whilst Keogh fell. The distinction mattered for medal considerations and regimental honours, but both men had risked death to seize something that couldn't be measured in tactical advantage. The Eagle's value was purely symbolic, yet that made it more precious than captured artillery or prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Gough, commanding the 87th, understood immediately what his regiment had achieved. The Irish recruits who'd been considered less experienced than Guards battalions had just performed the single most spectacular feat of the Peninsula War to date. They'd charged uphill under artillery fire, overwhelmed French defenders through sheer aggression, and captured Napoleon's sacred eagle in hand-to-hand combat. Gough ensured the eagle remained with regimental colours rather than being sent to army headquarters until Graham personally ordered its transfer. The possession of that bronze bird elevated the 87th from ordinary infantry to legendary status overnight. Across the British line, other units had also distinguished themselves. The 28th Foot, with their unique front and back cap badges, had shattered their opposing French column with volleys of mechanical precision. The Guards' flank companies had performed with the inhuman discipline their years of training produced, firing, reloading, and advancing as if on parade ground rather than battlefield. But none had captured an eagle. The 87th's achievement overshadowed everything else, and soldiers from other regiments offered grudging respect mixed with undeniable envy. Every British infantryman wanted his regiment remembered for capturing an eagle. The 87th had done it first. By 1:30, the battle's intensity had dropped to scattered musket fire as French rearguards covered Ruffin's withdrawal. British troops consolidated positions on Barossa hilltop, established pickets to warn of counterattacks, and began the grim work of collecting wounded. Battlefield medicine in 1811 was primitive and horrific. Surgeons could amputate shattered limbs with remarkable speed. A skilled surgeon could remove an arm in under 3 minutes, but had no anesthesia beyond alcohol and leather straps to bite. Infection killed most wound victims within days, regardless of surgical success. Men shot through the body usually died slowly from internal bleeding or sepsis. The 500 British wounded and 800 French wounded scattered across Barossa's slopes faced appalling fates. Many would die within hours. Many more would linger for days before succumbing to wounds that 20th century medicine could easily treat. The dead lay where they'd fallen, roughly 400 British and 1,700 French. Burial parties would work for days identifying bodies, searching for valuables to return to families, and interring corpses in mass graves. The smell of black powder smoke was gradually being replaced by the copper scent of blood and the beginning stench of decomposition in March sunshine. Soldiers who'd survived combat now faced the psychological aftermath, seeing friends dead or dying, processing their own terror now that adrenaline was fading, and dealing with the physical exhaustion of sustained combat. Graham rode his lines personally, congratulating regiments, visiting wounded officers, and ensuring defensive positions were properly established. His tactical judgment had been vindicated completely. The decision to fight rather than retreat had seemed reckless when outnumbered 2-1, but British firepower discipline had overcome numerical disadvantage exactly as he'd calculated. The decision to counterattack uphill had been even more audacious, yet it had secured the high ground and captured an eagle. Lesser commanders would have defended successfully and considered that adequate. Graham had turned defensive victory into offensive triumph. Around 2 o'clock, approximately 2 hours after the battle's conclusion, Spanish troops reappeared. General La Peña's 10,000 soldiers who'd marched away that morning returned from the north, having accomplished exactly nothing except abandoning their British allies to fight alone. The sight of Spanish columns approaching caused British soldiers to grip muskets with renewed tension. Officers had to restrain men from shouting insults or worse. The fury among British ranks was palpable and entirely justified. La Peña had refused support when Graham requested it, had ordered British retreat rather than commit Spanish forces, and had essentially abandoned 5,000 allies to face 9,000 enemies so he wouldn't risk his own troops. Graham's confrontation with La Peña was reportedly volcanic, though conducted with the formal courtesy military protocol required. The Spanish general attempted to claim credit for the victory, suggesting his forces' presence nearby had somehow contributed to French defeat. Graham's response, filtered through translator but unmistakably furious, made clear that Spanish troops had contributed nothing except betrayal. The captured eagle belonged to British forces. The victory belonged to British forces. Spanish participation had been worse than useless. It had been active abandonment of Allied commitments. La Peña attempted to justify his actions with reference to preserving Spanish forces for future operations, but his explanations convinced nobody, including his own officers. The political ramifications were immediate and lasting. British-Spanish military cooperation, already strained since Talavera in 1809, suffered irreparable damage. British officers who'd been willing to give Spanish regulars the benefit of doubt now considered them unreliable at best and actively treacherous at worst. Wellington, when he learned details of Barossa, was pleased with Graham's tactical victory, but apoplectic regarding Spanish betrayal. He'd already concluded after Talavera that Spanish regular armies couldn't be trusted in combined operations, and La Peña's conduct confirmed that assessment. Future British operations would minimize dependence on Spanish regular forces, relying instead on Spanish guerrillas who'd proven far more reliable. For Spain's military reputation, Barossa was catastrophic. Spanish forces hadn't fought at all whilst their British allies bled and died. The shame was compounded by British success. 5,000 British had won what 10,000 Spanish had refused to attempt. Spanish liberal politicians attempting to maintain alliance with Britain faced withering criticism. La Peña himself would eventually face court-martial in 1812, though political connections ensured his acquittal. His reputation never recovered, and he died in obscurity. But the damage to Spanish military prestige transcended one general's cowardice. The stereotype of Spanish unreliability was reinforced by Barrosa in ways that decades couldn't erase. The Eagle began its journey to London within days. Graham entrusted it to a reliable officer who would personally deliver it to the Prince Regent. The captured standard arrived in London to enormous public celebration. Britain had been at war with France since 1803, had suffered setbacks at Corunna and elsewhere, and needed tangible symbols of victory. The eagle provided exactly that: physical proof that Napoleon's elite troops could be beaten, their sacred symbols captured, their military mystique punctured. The Prince Regent received it in formal ceremony, and it was subsequently displayed in London, where citizens could view this trophy from distant Spanish battlefields. For the 87th Foot, the rewards were immediate and lasting. The regiment received official recognition, with Barrosa added to their colours as a battle honour. They were granted the unique privilege of displaying the captured eagle on their regimental insignia. Their nickname, the Fours, derived from the Irish war cry Fau a Bala, meaning clear the way, became inseparable from their identity. In later decades, the regiment would be granted royal prefix, becoming the Royal Irish Fusiliers, though that was partially for other actions. But Barossa remained their defining moment, the battle where Irish recruits had proven themselves equals to Guards battalions and captured Napoleon's eagle in the process. The aftermath of Barossa extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. French forces withdrew to their siege lines around Cádiz, bloodied but not broken. Ruffin's division had lost roughly 2,500 casualties from 9,000 engaged, severe but not catastrophic by Napoleonic standards. More damaging than the casualty count was the psychological blow. French soldiers who'd assumed British troops would break like Austrians or Prussians had learned a painful lesson. British infantry wouldn't break, would deliver murderous firepower, and would counterattack aggressively even when outnumbered. Marshal Victor's dispatches to Paris downplayed the defeat, but French soldiers who'd been there knew the truth. They'd been beaten decisively by an inferior force. The siege of Cádiz continued for another 16 months, finally lifting in August 1812, when Wellington's victories elsewhere forced French withdrawal from southern Spain. Barossa didn't break the siege directly, but it demonstrated that French forces around Cádiz were vulnerable to Allied offensive operations. Victor had to strengthen his siege lines' rear defences, diverting troops and resources that might otherwise have pressured the city. The strategic impact was modest, but real. Cádiz held, the Spanish government survived, and British prestige in Allied councils increased. British casualties totaled approximately 1,200 from 5,000 engaged, a 24% casualty rate that shocked even veterans accustomed to peninsular fighting. The 87th Foot had suffered disproportionately, with roughly 150 casualties from 650 engaged. The regiment's aggressive pursuit and eagle capture had been purchased with blood. Wounded soldiers faced horrific medical treatment with survival rates that seem incomprehensible by modern standards. Simple musketball wounds that missed major arteries or bones might heal if infection didn't set in, but infection was nearly universal. Surgeons used unsterilized instruments, had no antibiotics, and understood little about germ theory. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, using saws and knives. Men died from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection in overwhelming numbers. The captured material provided tangible measures of victory beyond the eagle. British forces secured 6 French artillery pieces, dozens of caissons filled with ammunition, and approximately 200 prisoners, including several officers. These were valuable tactically. Artillery could be turned on former owners, prisoners could be exchanged, and captured equipment proved British claims of victory. But none compared to the eagle's symbolic weight. Cannons could be replaced, prisoners exchanged, ammunition replenished. An eagle was irreplaceable. The French 8th Ligne Regiment would be disbanded, its number retired, and its officers would carry the shame of loss for the remainder of their careers. La Peña's return after battle with his unblooded 10,000 troops created a confrontation that nearly erupted into violence between British and Spanish soldiers. British troops who'd fought desperately whilst their allies marched away felt understandable rage at seeing Spanish forces reappearing to claim partial credit. Officers maintained discipline, but enlisted men shouted insults, and several physical altercations occurred before order was restored. Graham's official report to Wellington was diplomatic in language, but unmistakable in meaning. Spanish forces under La Peña had abandoned British troops, refused support, and contributed nothing to victory. Wellington's response was characteristically blunt. He'd warned that Spanish regular armies were unreliable, Barrosa confirmed it, and future operations would account for Spanish untrustworthiness. The political fallout in Spain was severe and lasting. Liberal Spanish politicians who'd advocated British alliance faced accusations of subordinating Spanish honor to British interests. Conservative factions used Barrosa to argue against continued cooperation with Britain. La Peña's defenders claimed he'd preserved Spanish forces for future operations rather than risking them unnecessarily, but this argument convinced few outside his immediate circle. The Spanish Cortes in Cádiz, embarrassed by their general's conduct, promised reforms and investigations that produced minimal results. La Peña retained command briefly before being reassigned, eventually faced court-martial in 1812, was acquitted through political maneuvering, and faded into historical ignominy. British military culture embraced Barossa enthusiastically. The battle exemplified everything British infantry doctrine claimed as advantages: disciplined firepower, aggressive counterattacks, courage under fire, and superior leadership. Regimental histories of the 87th, 28th, and Guards battalions prominently featured Barossa as proof of their martial excellence. The captured eagle became a totemic symbol displayed in Chelsea Hospital, where veterans and citizens could view it. Newspaper accounts celebrated Graham's leadership and the 87th's heroism with patriotic fervor that sometimes exceeded accuracy. The reality, a desperate defensive battle won through discipline and aggression, was dramatic enough without embellishment, but embellishment occurred anyway. Wellington absorbed Barrossa's lessons into his broader Peninsula strategy. Graham had demonstrated that British infantry could win when outnumbered if properly led and positioned. The battle confirmed Wellington's tactical doctrine, emphasizing defensive positions, firepower superiority, and aggressive counterattacks at decisive moments. But Barossa also reinforced Wellington's conclusions about Spanish regular forces. He'd rely on Spanish guerrillas, who'd proven consistently effective at harassing French communications and supply lines. Spanish regular armies would be kept in secondary roles where their unreliability couldn't compromise British operations. This wasn't prejudice, but pragmatic assessment based on repeated failures, including La Peña's abandonment at Barossa. French military analysis of Barossa varied by source. Official reports minimized the defeat, attributing it to terrain disadvantages and numerical exaggerations of British strength. But French officers who'd been present knew better. They'd seen British volleys shatter French columns through pure firepower superiority. They'd witnessed French soldiers who'd beaten Austrian and Prussian armies breaking under British musketry. Some French military thinkers began questioning column tactics against British lines, but institutional inertia and Napoleon's personal preference for columns meant French tactical doctrine remained largely unchanged. The result was that British-French battles throughout the peninsula continued following similar patterns: French columns attacking, British lines delivering devastating volleys, French attacks failing. The captured eagle's fate illustrates how military trophies become cultural artifacts. After ceremonial presentation to the Prince Regent and public display in London, it was eventually housed in the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. Over subsequent decades, it was transferred to various military museums. Today, it resides in the National Army Museum in London, a bronze sculpture representing Napoleon's imperial ambitions and British military triumph. Visitors can view it, read the inscription identifying it as the 8th Linea's standard, and imagine Sergeant Masterson fighting off French soldiers to carry it down Barossa Hill. The physical object connects modern observers to March 5, 1811, in ways that written accounts cannot. For the soldiers who'd fought at Barossa, the battle remained their defining experience. Veterans of the 87th Foot told stories of the Eagle's capture for decades afterward, embellishing details perhaps, but preserving the core truth. They'd charged uphill into French artillery, fought hand-to-hand for Napoleon's sacred symbol, and carried it away in triumph. Sergeant Masterson received promotions and recognition, though not the knighthood some suggested he deserved. Ensign Keogh survived his chest wound against all odds and continued his military career. Lieutenant Colonel Gough advanced to higher ranks, eventually becoming a general, always identifying himself as the officer who'd led the 87th at Barossa. Graham's reputation soared. At 62, he'd proven that age wasn't impediment to aggressive generalship. Wellington trusted him with independent commands in eastern Spain, where he performed competently, if not spectacularly. After the Peninsula War ended, Graham was raised to the peerage as Lord Lynedoch, received a pension from Parliament, and retired to Scotland. He lived to 95, dying in 1843 as one of the last surviving Peninsula War commanders. His obituaries universally cited Barossa as his greatest achievement, the day he'd chosen to fight when abandoned rather than retreat in shame, and won against impossible odds through aggressive tactics and trust in British infantry. Barossa's tactical significance extended beyond the immediate victory into broader questions of military doctrine, national military culture, and the mathematics of infantry combat. The battle provided a nearly perfect laboratory example of British two-rank line formation versus French column tactics, the fundamental doctrinal divide that characterized Anglo-French land combat throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Understanding why Graham's outnumbered force prevailed requires examining the tactical, training, leadership, and morale factors that combined to produce British victory. The firepower differential between line and column formations was mathematically straightforward but operationally decisive. British two-rank lines maximized the number of muskets that could fire simultaneously along any given frontage. Graham's 5,000 men deployed in line could theoretically bring all 5,000 muskets to bear, though in practice some were always reloading, casualties reduced numbers, and terrain affected deployment. But the principle held. British formations allowed maximum firepower. French columns, by contrast, could only fire from front ranks. A column of 3,000 men might be 200 wide and 15 ranks deep, meaning only 400 to 600 could fire, depending on how many ranks successfully aimed past those ahead. The mathematical result was that British forces could deliver 2 to 3 times the volume of fire per minute, despite being outnumbered overall. This firepower advantage only worked if British troops stood their ground until French columns closed to effective range. Napoleonic muskets were inaccurate beyond 100 yards for individual shots. Smooth-bore barrels meant balls tumbled unpredictably in flight. But at 50 yards into dense formations, accuracy became irrelevant. Every ball hit something. British doctrine emphasized holding fire until close range, then delivering massed volleys that tore apart French front ranks. At Barossa, the 87th Foot's first volley at 50 yards caused approximately 200 French casualties from 650 muskets firing. That's nearly 1 casualty for every 3 shots, exceptional by Napoleonic standards where most musket fire missed entirely. French column tactics weren't inherently inferior. They'd proven devastatingly effective against Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Columns allowed easier command and control, maintained cohesion during advances, and delivered psychological shock through sheer mass. Against armies that fired poorly disciplined volleys, then broke before columns closed, French tactics worked brilliantly. But British infantry didn't break. They'd been drilled obsessively in volley fire discipline, could sustain 3 to 4 shots per minute, and would stand their ground whilst French columns approached. The result was that French shock tactics repeatedly failed against British firepower tactics throughout the Peninsula War. Training intensity separated British infantry from most continental armies. British soldiers drilled constantly in loading and firing sequences until the movements became automatic. Bite cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, cock hammer, present, fire. The sequence had to be performed in 20 seconds under battlefield stress, with powder smoke obscuring vision, noise deafening, and casualties mounting. French infantry received less intensive training in musketry because French tactics emphasized speed and shock over sustained firefights. Spanish infantry training varied wildly by unit, but generally lagged behind both British and French standards. The result at Barossa was that British troops could deliver sustained fire at rates French columns couldn't match. Leadership at multiple levels proved decisive. Graham's strategic decision to fight rather than retreat established the precondition for victory. His tactical decision to counterattack uphill transformed defensive success into decisive triumph. At regimental level, officers like Lieutenant Colonel Gough of the 87th demonstrated aggressive leadership that inspired troops to charge uphill into artillery fire. At company level, captains and lieutenants maintained formations under fire, ensuring volleys were delivered on command rather than dissolving into individual panic firing. At platoon level, sergeants steadied men, filled gaps as casualties fell, and enforced discipline when exhaustion and fear tempted soldiers to break. French leadership at Barossa wasn't notably deficient, but it couldn't overcome the tactical disadvantages French doctrine imposed. Morale and psychological factors contributed significantly, though they're difficult to quantify. British troops knew they'd been abandoned by Spanish allies, which paradoxically strengthened resolve. They were fighting for regimental honor and national pride without expecting help. The knowledge that retreat meant humiliation created determination to stand firm. Additionally, Peninsula War veterans had fought French columns before and knew British tactics worked. This experiential confidence steadied troops when French numbers seemed overwhelming. French troops, conversely, had internalized assumptions about British behavior based on Corunna 1809, where British forces had retreated. Discovering that these British wouldn't break, despite numerical disadvantage, shocked French morale at the tactical moment when confidence mattered most. The Eagle's capture transcended tactical significance into psychological warfare. French military culture revered eagles as sacred symbols, linking regiment to emperor to French glory. Losing one meant permanent dishonor that couldn't be expunged. The 8th Lean Regiment's eagle had been blessed by Napoleon personally in 1804 ceremonies designed to create mystical connection between emperor and troops. When British soldiers carried it away on March 5, 1811, they didn't just capture a flag. They shattered the myth of French invincibility and demonstrated that Napoleon's sacred symbols could be torn from French hands and paraded through London streets. For British military culture, the captured eagle validated national self-conception as possessing superior infantry. British military thought in the early 19th century emphasized that British soldiers were individually superior to continental conscripts through training, discipline, and national character. This was partially true. British training was indeed superior, but also nationalistic mythology. The Eagle's capture provided tangible proof of claimed superiority. British propaganda depicted French soldiers fleeing whilst brave British troops stood firm, oversimplifying complex tactical realities into morally satisfying narratives. But the core truth remained. 5,000 British infantry had beaten 9,000 French veterans, captured their eagle, and done so whilst abandoned by allies. Strategic significance manifested in multiple ways beyond Barossa itself. The battle demonstrated that French forces in southern Spain were vulnerable to Allied offensive operations, forcing Marshal Victor to strengthen rear defences and divert resources from the Cádiz siege. British military prestige in Allied councils increased. Skeptical observers who'd questioned whether Britain could contribute militarily beyond naval power now had proof that British infantry could win major land engagements. Conversely, Spanish military prestige plummeted, reducing Spanish influence in Allied strategic planning. Wellington incorporated Barrossa's lessons into his broader Peninsular campaign strategy. He'd already concluded that British infantry properly positioned could defeat French forces, and Graham's victory confirmed that assessment. Wellington also noted that British troops could win when outnumbered if leadership was aggressive and tactics sound. But he remained cautious about risking British forces in uncertain situations. Graham's decision to fight at Barossa was bold, but also dangerous, and less favourable circumstances could have produced disaster. Wellington's subsequent operations maintained his characteristic caution, avoiding battles unless conditions favoured British advantages. French military leadership drew fewer productive lessons from Barossa than British counterparts. Some French officers recognized that column tactics against British lines consistently failed, but institutional inertia and Napoleon's personal preferences meant French doctrine remained largely unchanged. The result was that similar battles recurred: French columns attacking British lines, British volleys shredding French formations, French retreats. Salamanca in 1812 and Vitoria in 1813 would demonstrate the same patterns, confirming that French tactical doctrine couldn't overcome British firepower advantages. Modern military analysis studies Barossa as a case example in multiple contexts. Tactically, it demonstrates firepower superiority over shock tactics in infantry combat. Operationally, it illustrates how aggressive leadership can convert defensive success into offensive triumph. Strategically, it shows how psychological factors, eagles, abandoned allies, national pride, influence morale and combat effectiveness. In military staff colleges, Barossa appears in curriculum as example of leadership under pressure, coalition warfare challenges, and the importance of tactical doctrine matching technological realities. 5,000 British soldiers against 9,000 French veterans. Abandoned by 10,000 Spanish allies who marched away rather than fight. A 62-year-old general who chose honor over safety and attacked uphill instead of retreating to ships. An Irish regiment charging through artillery fire to capture Napoleon's Sacred Eagle in hand-to-hand combat. Barossa contained every element that makes military history compelling: impossible odds, betrayal, courage, and tangible symbols of triumph seized through blood and determination. The human cost deserves final reckoning before celebrating victory. 1,200 British casualties from 5,000 engaged meant that nearly 1 in 4 soldiers who'd stood in line that morning was dead or wounded by afternoon. The 87th Foot lost 150 from 650, almost 1 in 4. These weren't statistics. They were men with families, futures, and lives cut short or permanently altered. Ensign Keogh survived his chest wound against overwhelming odds, but dozens of officers and hundreds of enlisted men didn't. They died on Spanish hillsides far from home, buried in mass graves, mourned by families who'd received terse official notifications months later. French casualties exceeded 2,500, more men than the entire 87th Foot contained. 1,700 dead, 800 wounded severely enough to be incapacitated, and perhaps 200 captured. The French 8th Lean Regiment lost not just their eagle, but roughly 600 casualties and their institutional existence. The regiment was disbanded, its number retired, and surviving soldiers dispersed to other units bearing the shame of having lost their sacred standard. For French soldiers who'd survived Barossa, the battle meant wounds, disabilities, and for many, death from infections in following days. The primitive state of early 19th century military medicine meant that surviving initial combat was only the first challenge. Wounded men faced surgeons with unsterilized instruments, no anesthesia beyond alcohol, and no antibiotics. Amputation was the standard treatment for shattered limbs, performed at horrifying speed by surgeons who'd perfected technique through grim practice. Men died from shock during surgery, from blood loss afterward, or from infections that developed inevitably. Survival rates for serious wounds were perhaps 1 in 3. Lesser wounds that didn't require amputation still risked infection, gangrene, sepsis, and other conditions that 20th century medicine treats routinely, but which killed soldiers by thousands in 1811. The captured eagle's journey from battlefield to museum illustrates how military artifacts transcend their origins. Sergeant Patrick Masterson carried it down Barrosa Hill, surrounded by protective cordon of his regiment, then surrendered it to Lieutenant Colonel Gough, who presented it to Graham, who arranged its transport to London. The Prince Regent received it ceremonially, and newspapers celebrated its capture with patriotic enthusiasm. Over subsequent decades, it was displayed in Chelsea Hospital, then transferred to various military museums as Victorian Britain commemorated Peninsula War victories. Today, it resides in the National Army Museum in London, where visitors can view the bronze eagle sculpture, read the inscription identifying it as the 8th Linea's standard, and connect physically to events 2 centuries past. For the 87th Foot, Barrosa defined their regimental identity permanently. The battle honour Barossa was emblazoned on their colours. The captured eagle appeared on regimental insignia. Their nickname, the Fours, from Irish war cry For a Balla, clear the way, became inseparable from their identity. In subsequent decades, the regiment fought in other campaigns and earned additional honours, but Barossa remained paramount. Veterans told stories of the eagle's capture for decades, passing regimental mythology to new recruits who joined a regiment with legendary status. In 1881, army reforms merged the 87th with other Irish regiments to form the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and later consolidations created the modern Royal Irish Regiment, but Barossa honours remain part of that lineage. Sir Thomas Graham's later career vindicated his Barossa performance. Wellington trusted him with independent commands in eastern Spain, where he performed competently in operations around Vitoria. After the Peninsula War ended in 1814, Graham received a peerage as Lord Lynedoch, parliamentary pension, and public recognition as one of Britain's successful peninsular commanders. He retired to Scotland, outlived most contemporaries, and died in 1843 at 95 years old. His obituaries universally cited Barossa as his defining achievement, the day he'd defied logic, fought when abandoned, and won through aggressive leadership. Modern historians assess Graham as competent rather than brilliant, but his Barossa decision-making was exceptional. Choosing to fight showed moral courage, and choosing to counterattack showed tactical brilliance. General La Peña's fate illustrated how military disgrace follows cowardice. After Barossa, he retained command briefly through political connections, but British officials demanded his removal as condition for continued cooperation. Spanish authorities eventually court-martialed him in 1812 for abandoning allies, though political maneuvering secured acquittal. His military career ended in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, and his name became synonymous with unreliability. He died in obscurity, remembered only as the general who'd abandoned British allies and claimed credit for victories he hadn't fought. Spanish military historians still debate his actions. Some defend him as preserving Spanish forces, but most conclude he simply lacked courage to risk battle. British-Spanish military relations never fully recovered from Barossa's betrayal. Wellington had already concluded after Talavera that Spanish regular armies were unreliable. La Peña's conduct confirmed that assessment definitively. Subsequent British operations minimized dependence on Spanish regulars, relying instead on Spanish guerrillas who'd proven consistently effective at harassing French communications. When Spanish regulars participated in British operations, they were relegated to secondary roles where their potential unreliability couldn't compromise primary objectives. This wasn't prejudice, but pragmatic assessment based on repeated failures. Spanish military pride was wounded, but British commanders prioritized operational success over diplomatic niceties. The strategic impact of Barossa extended beyond immediate tactical results into the slow grinding that characterized Peninsula War. Britain's strategy under Wellington centered on bleeding French strength through attritional warfare, forcing France to maintain large armies in hostile territory where guerrillas and occasional British victories slowly destroyed French combat power. Barossa fit this pattern perfectly. It didn't end the siege of Cádiz immediately, didn't destroy French forces in southern Spain, didn't liberate significant territory. But it demonstrated that British forces could win against superior numbers. It weakened French forces around Cádiz, and it contributed to the accumulated psychological pressure that eventually forced French withdrawal from Spain in 1813-1814. Napoleon's perspective on Barossa, recorded in various memoirs and correspondence, reflected his broader frustration with the Peninsula War. He considered Spain the Spanish ulcer that bled French strength whilst accomplishing nothing strategically valuable. Barossa exemplified this problem, a relatively small engagement that cost France an entire regiment's worth of casualties, an eagle, and psychological damage to military prestige. Napoleon blamed subordinates, questioned Victor's competence, and issued contradictory orders that worsened coordination problems. But he never fundamentally reassessed French tactical doctrine. Column tactics continued despite repeated failures against British lines, because Napoleon believed columns worked and blamed defeats on subordinate failures rather than systemic problems. Modern military analysis examines Barossa through multiple analytical lenses. Tactically, it demonstrates firepower superiority over shock tactics when defending force maintains discipline. Operationally, it illustrates how aggressive leadership can seize opportunities that cautious commanders would miss. Strategically, it shows how psychological factors, symbolism, morale, national pride, influence combat effectiveness beyond purely material considerations. In staff colleges, Barossa appears as case study in leadership under pressure, coalition warfare challenges, and the importance of tactical innovation. The lessons Barossa offers remain relevant despite radical technological changes since 1811. Leadership matters. Graham's decision to fight when abandoned and to counterattack when successful required moral courage that can't be taught through doctrine. Training intensity matters. British superiority in musketry drill translated directly into combat effectiveness. Doctrine matters. French column tactics failed repeatedly against British lines because the tactical system couldn't overcome firepower mathematics. Morale matters. British troops fought harder because they believed in their cause, their commanders, and their tactical system. These principles transcend specific technologies and remain applicable in modern warfare. The captured eagle remains Barossa's most enduring symbol. It's a physical object connecting modern observers to March 5, 1811, bronze sculpture that French soldiers defended desperately and British soldiers seized violently. Visitors to the National Army Museum can view it, touch the glass case containing it, and imagine Sergeant Masterson fighting off French attackers whilst Ensign Keogh lay shot through the chest. The eagle represents everything Barossa meant: British tactical superiority, French humiliation, the psychological warfare that complemented physical combat, and the courage of soldiers who charged uphill into artillery fire because their general trusted them to win. March 5, 1811, proved that numbers alone don't determine victory. 5,000 British soldiers defeated 9,000 French veterans because they possessed superior training, better tactics, aggressive leadership, and the moral courage to fight when abandoned rather than retreat in shame. The 87th Foot's immortal charge captured an eagle that symbolized Napoleon's imperial power and proved that British infantry could defeat French elite troops in combat. Graham's decision to fight demonstrated that sometimes honor requires accepting impossible odds. And the battle's outcome validated British military doctrine that would eventually, through accumulation of victories like Barossa, contribute to Napoleon's ultimate defeat in 1815. That's why Barossa matters, because it showed that courage, discipline, and leadership could overcome impossible odds, and it provided tangible proof in the form of a bronze eagle that visitors can still view today.